You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network. For more quality options programs, visit www.theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app, available in iTunes and on Google Play.
Gold, crude oil, corn, soybeans, and more. With so many tradable products, the futures options market can be an intimidating place. How can you possibly keep track of the latest trading developments across so many different products? Don't worry, we've got you covered. Welcome to This Week in Futures Options, the program designed to help active futures options traders stay on top of this ever-changing marketplace. Each week, we'll break down the top trades, hot products, volatility explosions, and much more. This Week in Futures Options streams live, so be sure to check out our live stream via the Mixlr app. That's MIXLR. Or join our live chat room at mixlr.com/options-insider. Whether you're an experienced veteran or a newcomer looking to separate the wheat from the lean hogs, This Week in Futures Options has the information you can't find anywhere else. This Week in Futures Options is brought to you by CME Group, the world's leading and most diverse futures and options exchange. For more information and educational resources about futures options at CME Group, visit cmegroup.com/options. And now, get ready to break down the latest futures options trading activity. It's time for This Week in Futures Options.
All right, everybody, welcome to This Week in Futures Options. No live shows hitting the network this week. Doesn't mean we're going to leave you hanging here on Twifo, listeners. We're overdue for our mid-year check-in on the cross-correlation. How are these products stacking up this year from a correlation perspective? You usually like to do it at the beginning and middle of the year to get a sense for how things are evolving throughout the year. Listeners, haven't had a chance to do it on the show yet. We've been so jam-packed with great guests and so much action going on out there in futures options, but this is a perfect time, early August, to dive into a little bit of cross-correlation on your favorite products out there. Let's take a guess right now. I'll give you a couple seconds. See if you can guess which products had the highest and lowest correlation so far. We're just going back to the start of the year, listeners. Try to drill down to some of the interesting things. Let's light it up right now. What is the highest cross correlation on our board? All right, so we got some obvious ones that you'd expect, like the NASDAQ versus the E-mini, for example, moving pretty much in lockstep so far for the first half of this year. 0.96 to be precise, so about as close to 1-to-1 as you get. Also, the highest cross correlation and positive correlation on our board here. Other obvious ones, the 10-year versus the 30-year coming in 0.94 on our board. Again, a fairly obvious one, but we know all you rates heads are paying attention to it. Let's see if we can drill down, find some more surprising positive and then maybe some interesting negative correlation, shall we? Let's get out to FX. We're seeing the pound versus the euro. You might expect a decent correlation there, and that was the case so far for the first half of the year, 0.79. So not quite as strong, obviously, as the NASDAQ and the E-mini or the 10-year and the 30-year, but still a pretty strong positive correlation nonetheless. We've also seen strong correlation in the energy complex, and that remains the case so far this year. Heating oil versus WTI shaping up to be one of the other really strong positive correlations on our board. 0.87 right now, so coming in just under the NASDAQ E-mini and the 10-year, 30-year in terms of pretty much moving in lockstep, listeners. Let's dig a little deeper, though, shall we? Find some less heralded products. I've been saying for a while on Twifo, the livestock have kind of snuck up on us in terms of the volume that they're putting up these days from an options perspective. Also, pretty strong on the correlation front. Feeder cattle versus live cattle, moving pretty close so far the first half of this year as well. Not quite as strong as the other ones we're talking about, but at a 0.78, that is still a pretty strong positive correlation. Let's keep it in ags. Sometimes you like to drink your dairy, sometimes you like to eat it. Either way, cash settled cheese versus class 3 milk coming in slightly below our friends in the livestock at a 0.74 positive correlation. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? The metals have had a good year. I think anyone who's holding a little precious or even a little base metal in your back pocket or your safe deposit box or your futures or your GLD or SLV, however you play it, all having a pretty good year so far in 2025. And we're seeing that gold-silver correlation remain pretty strong, right around 2/3, 0.67 to be precise. If you're wondering how some of the other metals stack up, though, let's dive in a little bit. Platinum versus silver, both of them having pretty good years, both of them correlating pretty strongly to each other this year. 0.58 positive correlation between platinum and silver so far this year. If we're going out to copper versus silver, it's pretty much 50-50, 0.49 to the positive side right now for copper versus silver. The two Ps having a good year, palladium and platinum. Also a pretty strong positive correlation, 0.64 for those two precious metals. What about platinum versus gold? Not quite as strong, positive 0.4 on the correlation front there. And what is the lightest correlation in the main metals that we're tracking right here, listeners? Looks like it's palladium versus copper, only a positive 0.31 so far this year. Moving on to the ags, we expect to see strong correlation between the different wheats, and that is the case. KC wheat versus Chicago wheat coming in at 0.9, actually slotting in right below the NASDAQ and the E-mini and the 10-year and the 30-year, coming in pretty much number 3 on our overall positive correlation list for so far in 2025. But what about KC wheat or Chicago wheat versus the beans? That's a little bit softer correlation, listeners. KC wheat versus soybeans, positive 0.35. Chicago wheat versus soybeans, 0.36. So again, staying in that same ballpark. Soybean meal versus soybeans, also expect those to move pretty close to lockstep. A little bit shy of 0.7, 0.68. All right, the other question everyone has when we run these correlation numbers is, how does Bitcoin stack up to just about everything? Well, let's find out, shall we? The strongest positive correlation for Bitcoin was to the E-mini, S&P, and to the NASDAQ. Kind of expected. It's correlated pretty well to equities for a while. Positive 0.38. Again, not quite as strong as we've seen in the past. Maybe not as strong as some of the detractors who pretty much derided Bitcoin as just a high-tech allocation in your portfolio. Obviously not quite as strong as that, but positive 0.38, showing a modest positive correlation, at least through the first half of this year. Outside of that, the next strongest correlation so far this year is Bitcoin versus palladium, in the sense that both of them pretty much took a rocket ship to the moon for the first half of the year out here. Positive 0.21. Platinum, pretty close as well, positive 0.17. Interestingly enough, we don't see a lot of negative correlations on this list. The strongest negative correlation, which is pretty close to even, is Bitcoin versus soybean meal, negative 0.05, which is pretty much flat in terms of uncorrelated. But when we move out to FX, we do find some intriguing correlations out there between some of the currency pairs you might like to trade and some of the leading rates products. For example, the yen's been on our list quite a bit this year in terms of interest and action out there in the FX markets. And the yen right now versus the 10-year note, pretty decent positive correlation, positive 0.57 for the first half of this year. In fact, pretty much similar correlation levels, 0.5 or above for just about every spot, every stop on the yield curve, listeners. The pound and the euro, a little bit weaker versus the 10-year note, only a positive 0.35 correlation out there, listeners. And forget about the yen versus 3-month SOFR, only a positive 0.21 correlation out there, listeners. Let's go to the dark side now, see if we can find any interesting negative correlations. And the truth is, on this board, we don't see a lot, at least so far, for the first half of this year. Remember, very limited sample size, listeners. It's like the strongest negative correlation on our board so far this year is the 10-year note versus WTI, coming at almost a negative 0.3, negative 0.29 to be precise. Right behind it, we have the heating oil versus 10-year notes. Again, those heating oil WTI correlate pretty strongly, so not surprising to see them neck and neck in terms of negative correlation with the 10-year. 3-month SOFR versus the E-mini NASDAQ and the E-mini S&P, both hanging out negative 0.2 so far for the year on the correlation front. The yen versus the NASDAQ, negative 0.24, so getting a little bit stronger on the negative correlation front, but still, we're not getting much higher than negative 0.29, close to negative 0.23 on our list so far this year. See if we can spot any other interesting surprises before we get out of here for this year and come back at the end of the year, see how these correlations are stacking up. How about the yen versus gold, listeners? Positive 0.34 so far on the year for that one. Pound versus gold looking a little stronger, 0.39. And the euro versus gold at a positive 0.36. You want a surprising correlation? How about the E-mini versus feeder cattle? Positive 0.28. I bet you didn't have that one on your bingo card for this year, listeners. Right behind it, we have the E-mini versus live cattle, positive 0.25. Silver and the E-mini looking pretty good so far this year, positive 0.25 correlation as well. NASDAQ, same thing, positive 0.25 versus silver. Not as strong versus gold, pretty much uncorrelated, only a positive 0.04. Platinum, positive 0.19, and palladium, positive 0.18. If you're wondering, how's the E-mini stack up against WTI, positive 0.2. And in terms of correlation, the E-mini outside of the NASDAQ is moving pretty much in lockstep. And then in Bitcoin, positive 0.38, the correlation pretty much falls off a cliff. The next strongest correlation is actually between the E-mini and feeder cattle. Again, positive 0.28. So some interesting surprises on the board this year. That's going to do it for our quick mid-year cross-correlation recap. Hope you're having a great trading week out there. See you back live next week. Another great episode of This Week in Futures Options. And stay safe out there, everybody.
This Week in Futures Options is brought to you by CME Group, the world's leading and most diverse futures and options exchange. CME Group's markets help individuals and businesses around the world manage risks and seize opportunities. CME Group offers the deepest and most liquid options on futures across all asset classes, including interest rates, equity indexes, foreign exchange, energy, agriculture, and metals. For more information and educational resources about futures options at CME Group, visit cmegroup.com/options. This broadcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute trading advice or the solicitation of purchases or sale of any futures or options. The rulebook of the applicable exchange should be consulted as the authoritative source on all current contract specifications.